the flickering shadows of ancient temple corridors, where stone carvings tell stories that time has tried to bury, there existed a world where the boundaries between flesh and spirit dissolved into something far more profound than modern minds can comprehend. While medieval Europe burned women as witches for expressing their sexuality, and while desert religions preached that the body was a prison for the soul, ancient India was developing spiritual practices so revolutionary, so transgressive, that they would eventually be hunted to near extinction by conquerors and colonizers who could not understand what they were witnessing. The Kama Sutra that sits on coffee tables today, sanitized and reduced to a collection of athletic positions, represents merely the surface ripples of an ocean so deep and dangerous that entire civilizations conspired to drain it completely. What you are about to discover is not the romanticized tantra of weekend workshops or the commercialized spirituality of modern retreats. This is the archaeology of practices so intense, so challenging to conventional morality, that those who witnessed them chose silence over revelation, and those who practiced them risked everything for a glimpse of the divine through human flesh. Between the 6th and 11th centuries, in the hidden chambers of temples and the shadowed grounds where the dead were burned, priests and priestesses engaged in rituals that would shatter every assumption you hold about ancient spirituality. These were not the desperate acts of a decadent society, but meticulously codified sciences of consciousness, transmitted through generations of masters who understood that the human body contained doorways to experiences beyond ordinary reality. Today, we stand at the threshold of that forbidden world, ready to examine what powerful forces have spent 1,000 years trying to erase. But before we descend into these depths, I need to know where you are watching from and what time it is there, because this journey will take us across continents and centuries, and I want to understand who is brave enough to walk this path with me. And if you are ready to discover secrets that empires have tried to bury, hit that subscribe button, because what we uncover today is only the beginning of a story that will challenge everything you think you know about the relationship between body, spirit, and power. When scholars speak of ancient Indian sexuality, they inevitably stumble over a Sanskrit word that defies easy translation, mituna. To render it simply as sexual union misses the profound complexity of what this practice actually entailed. Mituna was not intercourse as we understand it today, driven by desire or pleasure or even love in the conventional sense. It was a ritual technology, a systematic method for dismantling the very foundations of individual identity through the most intimate physical act possible between human beings. The word itself comes from the Sanskrit root meaning to unite or to join, but this joining was understood to operate on multiple levels simultaneously. There was the obvious physical union of bodies, but beneath that lay the fusion of masculine and feminine cosmic principles, the dissolution of the boundary between self and other, and ultimately the merging of human consciousness with divine awareness. To participate in mituna required years of preparation that would transform every aspect of how a person related to their own body and to existence itself. In the tantric schools of Kashmir and Bengal, practitioners recognized 5 ritual elements known as the 5 makaras, each beginning with the Sanskrit letter M. These were madhya, fermented beverages; mamsa, flesh or meat; matsya, fish; mudra, ritualized hand gestures combined with specific grains; and finally, mituna, conscious sexual union. For Orthodox Hindus, these 5 elements represented absolute taboos, practices that would result in social ostracism and spiritual contamination. But for the tantrics, this very prohibition was precisely what gave these elements their transformative power. The logic was both simple and profound. Human consciousness is shaped by conditioning, by the endless repetitions of what is acceptable and what is forbidden, what is pure and what is impure, what brings us closer to the divine and what separates us from it. This conditioning creates mental prisons that prevent direct experience of reality as it actually is, beyond the categories and judgments that society imposes. by deliberately engaging with the forbidden, by consciously transgressing the boundaries that ordinary mind considers sacred, the practitioner could shatter these mental prisons and access states of awareness that were normally inaccessible. The preparation for mituna began months before the actual ritual. Participants underwent intensive purification practices that addressed not just physical cleanliness, but psychological and spiritual readiness. They would fast for days, consuming only water and specific herbal preparations that were believed to refine the subtle energies of the body. They meditated extensively on the nature of impermanence, spending hours contemplating death and the illusory nature of all phenomena that the mind considers solid and permanent. Most importantly, they engaged in mantra practice, the repetition of sacred sounds that gradually altered their state of consciousness. These were not casual recitations, but intensive vocal practices that could continue for 8 to 12 hours daily, repeated thousands of times until the sound began to resonate not just in the throat, but throughout the entire body. The mantras were specifically chosen to invoke particular deity forms and to prepare the practitioner's subtle energy system for the intense experiences that would follow. The actual ritual took place only on specific nights determined by lunar calculations and astrological considerations. The location was never casual or comfortable. Most often, ceremonies occurred in cremation grounds, places where human bodies were burned and where the reality of death permeated the atmosphere. This choice was deliberate and essential. Death was considered the greatest teacher, the ultimate reminder that all physical forms are temporary, and that clinging to any identity or experience leads inevitably to suffering. In this environment, saturated with mortality, surrounded by the ashes of the departed, and often within sight of funeral pyres, the ritual participants would gather. The woman in these ceremonies was not approached as an ordinary female, but as the living embodiment of Shakti, the primordial feminine energy that tantrics believed animated the entire universe. The man was instructed to see himself not as an individual personality, but as Shiva, the cosmic principle of pure consciousness that observes and transforms all experience. This was not poetic metaphor or symbolic thinking, but intensive visualization practice that could fundamentally alter perception. Through specific breathing techniques, internal muscle contractions, and silent mantra repetition, both participants would enter altered states of consciousness where ordinary identity began to dissolve. The boundaries between observer and observed, between male and female, between human and divine, would start to blur and eventually disappear entirely. The sexual practices themselves were unlike anything that modern minds associate with physical intimacy. The goal was never orgasm in the conventional sense, and certainly never ejaculation for male participants. Instead, both partners used precise techniques to circulate sexual energy throughout their bodies, directing it upward through the spinal column and into the higher energy centers located in the head. This process, known as urdhvaretas, could continue for hours, creating experiences of ecstasy that transcended ordinary physical pleasure. Advanced practitioners reported states of consciousness where individual identity vanished completely. They described visions of extraordinary beauty, inner sounds that seemed to come from beyond the physical world, and a sense of unity with all existence that made ordinary awareness seem like a pale shadow of reality. These were not hallucinations or wishful thinking, but reproducible experiences that could be achieved through proper technique and sufficient preparation. But here lies the element that scandalized even liberal Hindu society of that era. Mituna was not always practiced between married couples or even between partners who knew each other well. In certain ceremonial contexts, called chakra puja, multiple couples would gather in a circle, and the practice included the systematic exchange of partners. These exchanges were not random, but were determined by a ritual lottery or by direct instruction from the presiding guru. The purpose of this practice was to destroy one of the most fundamental attachments that keeps consciousness trapped in illusion: possessive love, and sexual jealousy. By watching one's regular partner engage in intimate union with another person, and by oneself engaging with unfamiliar partners, practitioners confronted the deepest layers of ego attachment. The intense emotions that arose, jealousy, possessiveness, the desire to control another person, were not suppressed or avoided, but observed directly and used as fuel for transcendence. For traditional Indian society, where marriage was considered sacred and sexual fidelity was the foundation of social order, these practices represented an unimaginable transgression. The very idea that spiritual advancement could come through deliberately violating the most basic rules of moral behavior was not just shocking, but potentially dangerous to the entire social structure. The transgression went even deeper. In the most radical tantric lineages, the woman chosen for ritual participation was deliberately selected from the lowest castes, or even from among the untouchables. The Chandalas who handled corpses and were considered so impure that their very shadow could contaminate a high caste person. For a Brahmin priest to engage in sexual union with such a woman was not merely breaking social convention, but committing an act so spiritually dangerous that it could result in immediate death at the hands of outraged community members. Yet this was precisely the point. The tantric masters understood that the deepest conditioning of human consciousness comes not from personal psychology, but from social programming. The caste system represented the most rigid form of mental imprisonment, a structure so deeply internalized that it operated below the level of conscious thought. Only by deliberately shattering these deepest taboos could a practitioner hope to break through to genuine spiritual freedom. The rituals were conducted with meticulous attention to detail, following procedures laid out in texts like the Colonial Tantra and the Mahanirvana Tantra. These were not spontaneous gatherings, but carefully orchestrated ceremonies that could take days to complete properly. Every gesture, every breath, every moment of the sexual union was governed by precise instructions that had been refined over centuries of practice. But the texts also contained stark warnings. Without proper preparation, without absolute purity of intention, and without the guidance of a master who had already traversed this dangerous territory, these practices would not lead to enlightenment, but to spiritual destruction. The forces being unleashed were compared to fire itself, capable of either illuminating consciousness or consuming it completely. The psychological impact on participants was profound and often permanent. Those who successfully completed the training reported a fundamental shift in how they experienced reality. The ordinary categories of pure and impure, sacred and profane, self and other, no longer held the same power over their minds. They had glimpsed something beyond the conditioning that normally governs human experience, and this glimpse could never be completely forgotten. As news of these practices spread beyond the tantric communities, the reaction was swift and violent. Orthodox Hindu authorities declared the tantrics to be heretics and outcasts. Buddhist monasteries refused them shelter. Even other spiritual teachers who practiced extreme austerities and renunciation found the tantric approach to be dangerously misguided. The controversy deepened when reports emerged of even more radical practices taking place in certain lineages. There were accounts of rituals involving multiple participants simultaneously, of ceremonies where the normal rules governing sexual behavior were not just bent, but completely inverted. Some texts hint at practices where elderly women guided young male initiates through experiences designed to shatter their assumptions about desire and fulfillment. These accounts, filtered through centuries of oral transmission and cultural interpretation, are difficult to verify historically, but their very existence points to the revolutionary nature of what the tantrics were attempting. They were not simply exploring alternative forms of sexuality, but conducting systematic experiments in consciousness using the most powerful forces available to human beings. The training required to participate safely in these experiments was extraordinarily demanding. Male practitioners spent years learning to control ejaculation completely, redirecting sexual energy through internal yogic practices that modern science has only begun to understand. They studied anatomy and physiology with a precision that would not be matched in the West until centuries later. They memorized vast collections of mantras and visualizations that could alter brain chemistry and nervous system function in ways that contemporary neuroscience is still trying to explain. Female practitioners, known as yoginis, underwent equally rigorous preparation. They learned to control their menstrual cycles through breathing and meditation techniques. They studied the subtle energy anatomy of their own bodies with an intimacy that allowed them to consciously direct the flow of sexual energy to any part of their system. They developed the ability to enter trance states so deep that ordinary consciousness would disappear entirely, leaving only pure awareness witnessing the sexual experience without personal involvement. The relationship between male and female practitioners was unlike anything found in conventional religious traditions. Women were not considered spiritually inferior or in need of male guidance. Instead, they were revered as the primary holders of Shakti, the creative power that brings all phenomena into existence. In many tantric lineages, the female guru held ultimate authority, and male students served essentially as instruments for her spiritual experiments. This reversal of normal gender hierarchy was another source of scandal for traditional society. The idea that women could be spiritual teachers, that they might possess knowledge unavailable to men, that they could use male bodies as tools for their own enlightenment, challenged every assumption about the natural order of things. The practices themselves evolved over time, as different teachers experimented with variations and refinements. Some lineages developed techniques for group ceremonies involving dozens of participants. Others focused on intensive one-on-one practices between carefully matched partners. Still others explored the boundaries of what was possible when sexual energy was combined with other consciousness-altering substances like cannabis or specially prepared herbal compounds. The most advanced practitioners claimed to achieve states where individual identity dissolved so completely that the question of who was making love with whom became meaningless. They reported experiences of cosmic unity, where personal boundaries vanished and consciousness expanded to encompass entire universes of experience. Whether these reports represent genuine spiritual attainment or elaborate self-deception remains a matter of debate among scholars. But the consistency of the accounts across different lineages and time periods suggests that something extraordinary was indeed taking place. The secrecy surrounding these practices was absolute. Initiates took vows of silence that were enforced by the threat of spiritual and physical punishment. The knowledge was transmitted orally from master to disciple, with written records kept deliberately obscure and coded. Even today, scholars studying tantric texts must work like cryptographers, piecing together fragments of meaning from metaphorical language that was designed to conceal as much as it revealed. This secrecy was not mere paranoia, but a practical necessity. The practices were so far outside normal social boundaries that public knowledge of them would have resulted in violent persecution. The tantric communities developed elaborate systems of coded communication, secret meeting places, and protective rituals designed to shield their activities from outside observation. But secrecy alone could not protect them from the forces that were already gathering to destroy everything they had built. The world was changing in ways that would make their radical experiments in consciousness impossible to sustain. The first wave of destruction arrived with the thunder of hooves and the gleam of curved swords. Mahmud of Ghazni crossed the mountains from Afghanistan in the early 11th century, his armies driven by a combination of religious fervor and the promise of legendary temple treasures. What he found in the Hindu kingdoms of northern India challenged every assumption his Islamic worldview could accommodate. The temples of Khajuraho and Konark rose from the landscape like fever dreams carved in stone, their walls covered with sculptures that depicted human sexuality in forms so explicit and varied that even seasoned warriors stopped in their tracks. Here were images of couples locked in impossible embraces, group scenes that defied conventional morality, and solitary figures engaged in acts of self-pleasure, rendered with artistic precision that elevated them to the level of divine worship. For soldiers raised in a tradition where the human form was considered too sacred to depict in religious art, where sexuality was heavily regulated by religious law, these temples represented something beyond mere heresy. They were evidence of a civilization so fundamentally different from their own that coexistence seemed impossible. The response was swift and merciless. Temple after temple fell to Islamic armies, their sculptures defaced or destroyed entirely, their libraries burned, their priests scattered or killed. But the destruction was not merely military. It was ideological, aimed at erasing not just the physical manifestations of these practices, but the very memory that they had ever existed. The invaders understood instinctively that these sexual practices represented a threat to the social order they intended to impose. A religion where the body was sacred, where sexual union could lead directly to divine experience without institutional mediation, challenged the foundation of any power structure based on controlling and regulating human behavior. The systematic nature of this destruction reveals how thoroughly the invaders grasped what they were confronting. They did not simply loot temples for gold and jewels, though they certainly did that. They specifically targeted the libraries where tantric texts were kept, the residential quarters where practitioners lived, and the sacred groves where outdoor ceremonies took place. This was cultural genocide, conducted with methodical precision. Yet some knowledge survived, hidden in remote mountain monasteries, or preserved by families who had served tantric masters for generations. The practices went underground, maintained by small communities who understood that their traditions could only survive through absolute secrecy. They developed new codes, new ways of transmitting knowledge that could pass undetected by hostile authorities. The situation became even more desperate with the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate and later the Mughal Empire. These were not temporary raids, but permanent occupations, creating administrative systems designed to transform Indian society according to Islamic principles. The jizya tax imposed on non-Muslims created economic pressure to convert. The destruction of Hindu temples became official policy under rulers like Aurangzeb, who viewed the elimination of idolatry as a religious obligation. The tantric communities faced a terrible choice. They could abandon their practices entirely and hope to blend into conventional Hindu society, or they could maintain their traditions at the risk of persecution and death. Most chose survival over authenticity, allowing their lineages to die out rather than expose their remaining members to danger. The few masters who continued teaching became impossibly selective about their students. The casual inquirer, the spiritually curious, even the genuinely devoted seeker might be turned away after years of patient waiting. Only those who demonstrated absolute commitment, who were willing to sacrifice everything for the knowledge, were granted access to the inner teachings. This extreme selectivity meant that the transmission of knowledge slowed to a trickle. Lineages that had once trained dozens of students now accepted perhaps one new initiate every decade. The rich diversity of practices that had flourished in the earlier period began to crystallize around a few core techniques that could be preserved most easily. The arrival of European colonial powers in the 18th and 19th centuries brought new forms of oppression that were in some ways more devastating than Islamic persecution. The Muslims, at least, operated from within a framework that acknowledged the sacred, even if they rejected Hindu expressions of it. The British brought with them a mechanistic worldview that reduced all religious practices to primitive superstition or social pathology. British administrators and missionaries encountered the surviving remnants of tantric culture with a mixture of fascination and horror that was distinctly Victorian in character. They were simultaneously attracted to the exotic nature of what they discovered and repulsed by its challenge to Christian sexual morality. Their response was to criminalize these practices while simultaneously studying them with the detached curiosity of anthropologists examining curious customs. The legal framework imposed by British rule made the practice of traditional Tantra virtually impossible. Laws against obscenity, vagrancy, and public morality could be used to prosecute anyone suspected of participating in tantric rituals. The colonial administration created a bureaucratic apparatus that monitored and controlled religious activities with an efficiency that earlier persecutors had never achieved. More insidiously, British education systems began producing a new class of Indians who viewed their own traditions through colonial eyes. These English-educated elites internalized Victorian attitudes towards sexuality and began to see tantric practices as embarrassing remnants of a primitive past that needed to be abandoned for India to take its place among civilized nations. The independence movement of the 19th and 20th centuries, while politically liberating, was culturally devastating for tantric traditions. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, deeply influenced by Christian concepts of purity and restraint, promoted an ideal of spiritual life that was fundamentally incompatible with tantric practices. Gandhi's emphasis on brahmacharya, absolute celibacy, as the foundation of both personal and political strength, represented a complete reversal of tantric values. The new Indian nation that emerged from independence in 1947 was eager to present itself to the world as modern, rational, and morally respectable. The exotic sexuality that European Orientalists had associated with India became a source of national embarrassment. Government policies actively discouraged practices that might reinforce Western stereotypes of Indian primitivism and sensuality. Educational curricula were designed to emphasize India's philosophical and mathematical contributions to world civilization, while minimizing or ignoring entirely its traditions of sacred sexuality. The great temples of Khajuraho and Konark were preserved as archaeological monuments and tourist attractions, but their original spiritual significance was explained away as fertility symbolism or artistic expression, rather than documentation of actual religious practices. The few tantric teachers who survived this cultural transformation found themselves completely isolated from mainstream Indian society. They could no longer recruit students from the traditional communities that had supported them for centuries. The social networks that had sustained tantric practice had been thoroughly disrupted by modernization, urbanization, and the adoption of Western values. Even within Hindu religious circles, tantric practices became increasingly marginalized. The dominant forms of Hinduism that emerged in the modern period emphasized devotion, philosophy, and ethical behavior, rather than the radical experimentation with consciousness that had characterized tantric traditions. Tantric teachers found themselves regarded with suspicion, even by other Hindu spiritual leaders. The situation was complicated by the emergence of fraudulent teachers who appropriated tantric terminology and imagery while promoting practices that had nothing to do with authentic tradition. These charlatans, often motivated by money or personal gratification, created scandals that further damaged the reputation of genuine tantric lineages. As the 20th century progressed, the knowledge holders faced a crisis of transmission unlike any in their history. The traditional methods of passing knowledge from master to disciple required stable communities, supportive social environments, and students who were willing to dedicate decades to intensive training. None of these conditions existed in modern India. Some masters made the difficult decision to break with tradition and begin accepting Western students, calculating that preservation of the knowledge in any form was preferable to allowing it to die out entirely. This created new problems, as Western students often lacked the cultural background and linguistic skills necessary to understand tantric concepts in their original context. The commercialization of Eastern spirituality in the West during the 1960s and 70s brought tantric concepts to international attention, but in forms so distorted that traditional practitioners barely recognized them. Weekend workshops promising instant enlightenment through sacred sexuality bore no resemblance to the decades-long training that authentic Tantra required. Meanwhile, in India itself, the last generation of traditional masters was aging and dying without successors. The oral traditions that had survived centuries of persecution were finally succumbing to the pressures of modernity. Ancient practices that had required the memorization of thousands of Sanskrit verses were being abandoned as impractical in a world where information could be stored electronically. The physical spaces where tantric practices had taken place were also disappearing. The cremation grounds that had served as ritual sites were being relocated or modernized in ways that eliminated their traditional spiritual significance. The remote forest hermitages where masters had trained disciples were being cleared for development, or incorporated into wildlife preserves where human activities were prohibited. Perhaps most tragically, the social structures that had made tantric practice possible were being systematically dismantled. The complex relationships between different castes and communities that had sustained these traditions for centuries could not survive the equalitarian ideologies of modern democratic society. The very diversity that had allowed tantric experimenters to transgress social boundaries was being homogenized in the name of social progress. By the end of the 20th century, authentic tantric practice had been reduced to a handful of elderly masters scattered across India and Tibet, each guarding fragmentary knowledge that might die with them. The great experiment in consciousness that had flourished for over a millennium had been brought to the verge of complete extinction. Yet even in this desperate situation, the tradition showed signs of adaptation that suggested it might survive in new forms. Some masters began working with psychologists and neuroscientists to translate tantric concepts into modern scientific language. Others experimented with technology, using recording equipment and video to preserve teachings that had previously been transmitted only through direct contact. The most promising developments involved the recognition that tantric principles could be separated from their specific cultural expressions and applied in contemporary contexts. The core insights about consciousness, energy, and the transformation of sexual experience into spiritual fuel remained valid even when stripped of their traditional ritual framework. Modern practitioners began developing approaches that honored tantric wisdom while acknowledging the realities of contemporary life. They created new forms of practice that could be pursued by people living in urban environments, working conventional jobs, and operating within the constraints of modern relationships and social expectations. These adaptations represented both loss and evolution. Much of the depth and precision of traditional practice was inevitably sacrificed when ancient techniques were translated for modern use. But the alternative was complete extinction, and even a diluted form of the tradition was preferable to total loss. The question that haunted the remaining masters was whether these modern adaptations could preserve the essential transformative power that had made tantric practices so extraordinary. Could the profound shifts in consciousness that had been achieved through traditional methods be replicated using contemporary approaches? Or would something crucial be lost in translation? The answer would determine whether the tantric experiment in sacred sexuality would continue into the 21st century or join the countless spiritual traditions that had been consumed by the relentless advance of modernity. The final chapter of this ancient story was still being written, and its outcome remained uncertain. The answer began to emerge in the most unlikely places, whispered in languages that colonial administrators never bothered to learn, preserved in palm leaf manuscripts that British archaeologists dismissed as primitive superstition. While the world believed these traditions had been completely eradicated, small communities scattered across the Indian subcontinent were quietly maintaining practices that connected them to an unbroken chain stretching back over 1,000 years. In the remote villages of Assam, where mist rises from ancient rivers and temple bells still mark the passage of sacred time, elderly women continued to teach their daughters techniques that had once been common knowledge among temple dancers. These were not the sanitized classical forms promoted by cultural ministries, but movements that channeled specific energies through precise gestures, breathing patterns that could alter consciousness within minutes. and visualizations that transformed ordinary awareness into something approaching the divine. The knowledge survived because it had been encoded in ways that outsiders could not recognize. What appeared to be simple folk songs actually contained detailed instructions for advanced sexual practices. Traditional wedding ceremonies included rituals that were barely modified versions of ancient tantric initiations. Even children's games preserved movement patterns that had once been used to train the body for spiritual transformation. But the most significant preservation occurred within families who had served as temple functionaries for generations. These hereditary guardians of sacred knowledge faced an impossible burden. They were the last repositories of information that could not be written down safely, could not be discussed openly, and could not be transmitted to anyone outside their bloodlines without risking not just persecution, but the complete corruption of practices that required absolute precision to remain effective. The psychological toll on these knowledge keepers was immense. Many reported dreams where ancient masters appeared to them, demanding that the traditions be preserved at any cost. Others described a crushing sense of responsibility, knowing that centuries of accumulated wisdom might die with them if they failed to find suitable successors. Some broke under the pressure, abandoning their roles entirely and allowing their lineages to end rather than face the daily reminder of what was being lost. Yet a few persevered, developing ingenious methods for maintaining the integrity of their teachings while adapting to modern circumstances. They created new forms of coded language that could pass undetected in contemporary conversations. They embedded crucial information in seemingly innocuous activities like cooking, gardening, or craftwork. They established networks of communication that allowed isolated practitioners to maintain contact without attracting unwanted attention. The most remarkable of these preservation efforts involved the development of what can only be called tantric families, multi-generational groups where advanced practices were maintained as completely normal aspects of daily life. Children in these households grew up with concepts and experiences that would have seemed impossible to their contemporaries, learning to control their sexual energy before they understood what sexuality meant in conventional terms. These family lineages developed their own internal cultures that were simultaneously ancient and completely modern. They used traditional Sanskrit terminology while discussing quantum physics. They practiced medieval breathing techniques while working in contemporary professions. They maintained ritual purity standards that had been established centuries earlier while living in urban apartments and dealing with modern technology. The sexual practices themselves evolved in fascinating ways. Unable to gather in large groups or use traditional ritual spaces, practitioners developed techniques that could be employed by couples in private homes. The elaborate ceremonies that had once required days of preparation were condensed into practices that could be completed in a few hours. The complex partner exchanges that had scandalized traditional society were replaced by visualization techniques that achieved similar psychological effects without requiring multiple participants. But the essential transformative elements remained unchanged. Practitioners still learned to redirect sexual energy throughout their bodies using precise combinations of breath control, muscle tension, and mental focus. They still approached sexual union as a form of worship where ordinary identity dissolved into cosmic awareness. They still used transgression and taboo breaking as tools for shattering mental conditioning, though the specific taboos they challenged had to be updated for contemporary circumstances. The secrecy surrounding these modern practitioners was even more complete than what their ancestors had maintained. They developed elaborate double lives, appearing to their neighbors and colleagues as conventional citizens, while privately engaging in practices that would have shocked even liberal observers. They learned to communicate through subtle signals and coded references that allowed them to recognize other practitioners without revealing themselves to outsiders. This underground continuation of tantric tradition created a shadow culture within modern Indian society, invisible to academic researchers, government officials, and even most religious leaders, but maintaining practices that connected its members to experiences of consciousness that mainstream culture had forgotten were possible. The participants in this shadow culture reported that their practices not only survived the transition to modernity, but in some ways became more powerful, as the increased repression and secrecy intensified the transformative effects of transgression. Meanwhile, in the Tibetan refugee communities that had formed after the Chinese invasion, another stream of preservation was taking place. The Buddhist tantric traditions that had developed in Tibet included many practices that were closely related to the Hindu Tantra being suppressed in India, and these refugee communities maintained their traditions with a dedication that bordered on desperation. The Tibetan approach to preservation was more systematic than what was happening in India. Lamas who had escaped the destruction of their monasteries made the conscious decision to document everything they could remember, creating extensive written records of practices that had previously been transmitted only orally. They established new teaching centers in exile that continued traditional training methods, though the number of students was necessarily limited. But the Tibetan preservation effort faced unique challenges. The cultural context that had made their practices meaningful was completely destroyed. The monastic institutions that had supported advanced training no longer existed. The social relationships that had sustained tantric communities had been severed by exile and dispersal. The teachers had to find ways to maintain authentic transmission while operating in completely foreign environments. Some Tibetan masters made the radical decision to begin accepting Western students, calculating that preservation of the teachings in any form was preferable to allowing them to disappear entirely. This created unprecedented situations where ancient Tibetan practices were being transmitted to American and European students who lacked any cultural preparation for what they were receiving. The sacred fires that once burned in temple chambers have been extinguished. The stone carvings that documented humanity's most profound experiments in consciousness have been defaced or forgotten. And the lineages that preserve these transformative practices for over a millennium teeter on the edge of final extinction. Yet beneath the surface of our sanitized modern world, fragments of this ancient wisdom persist, waiting to be rediscovered by those brave enough to question everything they have been taught about the relationship between flesh and spirit, between desire and transcendence, between the individual self and the infinite mystery that surrounds us all.